Thank you for having me. I appreciate New Scholars inviting me out a second time. In some ways, I wish I would have done this one first and the first one second, but hopefully it will be helpful. So, welcome everyone. I'm going to just say hello because we have people from different time zones. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Uh, we're going to talk about coding and analysis in qualitative research. To set the stage, I'm going to say, first of all, as Ibrat had said, I do welcome questions. I will pause periodically throughout the talk to answer questions. The talk has two basic halves. The first one is going to be on coding. The second part is going to be on analysis. So I will stop after the coding part for questions and then stop at the end for questions about analysis. If you tuned in and said, "Oh, is this a talk on AI and qualitative analysis?" No, it's not. The people are working on it. Some really interesting work in this area. Maybe that'll be a future talk, but not something I'm going to be covering at any length today. And then I do have a few articles that I've asked you brought to send you all after the talk. I'm drawing out a lot of these articles for this particular presentation. So if you miss something in what I'm saying, or I wouldn't even worry about taking notes. The articles will have most of what I'm talking about today. So can I get like thumbs up? People can hear me okay? All right, awesome. If I end up talking too fast, just let me know. I'm a fast talker. All right, last thing is when I talk about coding and I talk about analysis, I'm going to talk about them in two different ways. First, I'm going to give a very kind of hands-on how to do portion. So how do you code? How do you do analysis? And then I also want to take a step back. It's thinking more broadly. How should we be thinking about coding? How should we be thinking about our analysis? So stay tuned for that. So I always like to start talks with some disclaimers so that I don't over promise. Um, First of all, this is a very big topic. I'm largely going to draw upon things that I've read, written about, but also on my own experience. For the sake of parsimony, I may talk about a lot of things in a very general sense. Um, doesn't mean that there's more here. So therefore, because I'm going to talk kind of generally, are there any exceptions to what I might be saying? Yes. Depending on let's see if you're doing hermeneutics, ethnography, case studies, grounded theory may all have slight variations in how you code and how you analyze. So there may be some variations of what I say today. It doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean, oh, I'm just going to decide to code in some kind of random way. We'll talk about some good practices today. The second thing you may ask yourself, well, I learned everything I need to know about coding and analysis and qualitative research in 90 minutes. Of course not. This what I'm hoping to do. My goal is not really to it's to really for have you to think about this is not the last word or where you would stop your inquiry or curiosity about coding analysis, but really as the start of a conversation and really hopefully a start for you to say, oh, I was interested in this, and maybe you'll seek out different sources and different ways to do things. So with that as a preview, we are ready to dive in. Are you ready? Good. Thank you. All right, let's start with some terminologies. First, I'm going to start with what a code is. And by the way, I don't receive any advertising dollars from any author. So if I promote a book, it is because I like it. It's not because I'm getting paid to do it. But Saldana has an amazing book on coding. I think there's over 60 ways of coding he talks about in his book. So if you're interested in coding as a topic, I would look for his 2021 book. It's quite good. And he defines coding as a word or short phrase that symbolically assigns a summative, salient, essence capturing, and or evocative attribute for a portion of language-based or visual data. So breaking this down, first of all, codes are words. They're words or short phrases. They could be a single word. They could be I've had codes that run on for several words. Really depends on what you're coding and what you're trying to capture. The key is, I like this idea of essence capturing. What you're trying to do with the code is try to figure out like what's going on here? What do I see here? And so you want to think of codes as trying to get at, by getting an essence, you're not just summarizing, but you're also trying to get what's at the heart of what I'm looking at. And it can be for language-based or visual data. So normally, and the examples used today will be on coding text, but you could also code like video analysis as well. Coding is the assigning of these words or phrases, and that's part of a larger process of analysis. For many years, I didn't really distinguish coding from analysis. I thought they were the same thing. So hopefully by the end of today, you realize they are not. I see analysis much more broadly as a kind of a systematic way of analyzing or approaching data. Sorry, can't even say word. A systematic way of approaching data for the purpose of better understanding it. It's very broad, but it's essentially I'm trying to make sense of my data. Coding is one way to make sense of your data. Coding is a way to kind of like break things down into smaller chunks. But there are other things I'll talk about later in the talk, like creating memos or having a research journal that tries to get a more holistic approach or a more holistic understanding of your data. So rather than breaking down things into small parts like coding does, you may get at broader sweeps of your data. So hopefully this will become clear as we move along. In general, there's two kinds of codes, and that's emergent coding. And this is coding that comes from your data. So I don't have, I'm going through my, let's say a transcript, making notes, and the codes are coming from that data. That's the other way to do coding is a priori or structured. The sad thing about methodology and pretty much a lot of academia is that people use different terms to mean essentially the same thing. So if you see structured or a priori, they're probably talking about the same thing. That's if I have a code book or something that I set out before I analyze my interviews. When you do this is a deductive coding of data, and I'm not really going to focus as much on that. I'm really going to focus much more in inductive coding, and that'll be emergent from your data. Another thing, just kind of before we start, where does coding fit? Where does the coding analysis fit into the broader, qualitative research project? So this is a figure from a paper that I will send out at the end of the talk. And so qualitative research, it's not linear, but just to kind of give you a visual, you start out by designing a research project, you collect your data. Obviously, you have to have data before you code your data, so that's going to be before that. But in many qualitative approaches, such as grounded theory, you're going to be coding and analyzing and gathering data all at the same time. So it's an iterative process. And then you code data, presumably, before you publish it. So, but even as anybody who's gone through a review process, you may write a paper, send it in review, the reviewers say, go back and recode your data, reanalyze your data. And so it's an iterative process. But coding and analyzing occur usually post data collection before you write it out. So I'm going to say, does analysis change depending on the emergent or a priori? Yes. In part because if you're going in a priori, you probably have a broader sense of what you're looking at before you go in. My sense is going to be captured. Can you hybrid coding? Yes. Sometimes we'll talk about this. Coding can change throughout your process. And so you may end up moving from emergent to coding as you move on. But let me get to that in just a second. So we're going to talk with some basic how-to questions. First question is, when should I code? And this actually varies depending on a couple different questions. I know it's not polite to answer a question with the question, but if you will allow me, I'm going to ask you some more questions. So really depends on your research or an analytical approach. It's a problem when you're undercaffeinated. Analytical. So there we go. Um, First of all, everything, by the way, when coding and analysis depends on your research question. So, for example, if I'm doing some kind of a linguistic analysis on, I want to understand how people think about authenticity. Well, then I'm going to code a lot around a particular word. Maybe maybe I'm trying to be much more broad, much more inductive. Um, and maybe I want to look at everything. So I might code differently or code sooner or later in the process. For ethnographies, we'll talk about coding actually happens a little later in the process than I think for grounded theory. Because in ethnography, you really want to get a kind of a sense of the cultural scene before you start coding. Um, so that's the first question, like, what is my analytical approach? Am I taking, case studies, grounded theory? Um, the second thing you want to think about is what kind of coding do you want to do? And somebody did a question about hybrid coding, like, would I ever have uh, I'm not sure if this is exactly hybrid. Let's say you're going through your data. Usually the first time you go through your data, you're going to be coding close to the data. Your codes might be what we call in vivo or terms that people use. And so that kind of coding you may want to do when you start. But later on, by the way, you're probably going to want to recode your data. I'm going to say you actually will want to recode your data at some point. So at that point, you may want to get more abstract. But that abstract coding you don't want to start with. And this is probably the biggest mistake I see uh, people who are learning qualitative methods do. They say, well, I want to make this more efficient. I want to skip the line and move right to abstract coding of my data with theoretical terms on my first time through. That is not a good idea. Somebody asked, I mean, that's when the reason why it's not a good idea is that one of the main reasons you do qualitative research is to understand the lived experience of the people that you're studying. And your first obligation, I guess probably the best way to put it, your first obligation is to really understand their life first. And you can't do that if you're throwing on academic terms before you start. So I tend to start with much closer to the data, understanding their worldview. We call them informants in ethnography because they inform what you're talking about. I want to understand that first. So my first coding is I'm going to code early on in that way and not move to more abstract coding until later in the process. That said, even though coding may not start immediately, you're going to probably start analysis immediately. Analysis is just trying to make sense of the data. So when I talk to somebody, I might do a memo afterwards. I may just start, this happens to me. I may do an interview, then I just kind of think about the interview, like what just happened here? What did I find interesting? So analysis happens, I say, at the beginning. Coding often happens after I've usually have a little bit of a sense of what's going on in the research in the context that I'm looking at. The second question I get a lot is, how much should I code? So let's say you have an interview transcript. It could be 10, 20, 30 pages single spaced, depending how long your interview was. And some people have asked you, can I just skip parts? Can I just, I don't, this answer doesn't, I'm not sure I really am that interested in this answer. Can I just skip this through? My I'm going to talk just to kind of preview what I'm going to say. I don't suggest doing that. I suggest try to code everything to start. How you code it may different. So let's say you're getting, and I'm going to use an example in the next slide of one of my informants, who seemed to just be rambling on about something. And my first approach when I saw this, when I looked at the data, I was like, I'm just going to skip this. I don't really care about their ideas of, how people look at her as a widower. And I don't know how that answers my research question. But fortunately, I initially blocked it off as discussions of her, it's discussions of life as a widower. That was what I found later, is that I needed to go back and recode that, because that ended up being really important to think about how she, this was a female informant, how she thought about the world in relation to the context. So this is an Amway distributor. She talked about how Amway distributors treat widowers differently than people outside of Amway. So what ended up at the beginning I thought was kind of nonsense actually ended up being really important for another paper. So code everything to start, especially in the beginning part of your analysis. Sorry, especially the first part, like when you're first starting to code your data, code everything. It could be over time, your 30th, 40th, 50th interview, you have a better sense of what you're looking at. You may want to not code quite as carefully. Um, all that said, I often, even at the end of interviews, I sometimes will just like block off a big paragraph or section of data saying, you know, what it's about, so I can go back later in case I need to analyze it at a finer grain. That brings us to our next point: is how granular should your data or should your codes be? That means, should I code each word? Should I code line by line? Should I code a paragraph? Um, it varies. Um, some really strict grounded theory people want you to code line by line. I like the term meaningful chunk. Doesn't meaningful chunk is sometimes a paragraph is a statement, is a thought. Sometimes it's a line. Sometimes it's half a sentence. So really, what I'm looking at is like, for me, I want to code something that coheres, whatever that code, whatever that text is, that coheres in a particular way. So I'm trying to make sense of a part of a text, and sometimes it's a word. So in Amway, they had this term, half couple, which I was interested, like, what does half couple mean? So I coded that saying, Amway term, think about later. And I found out half a couple means if a married couple is in Amway and only one person is building the business, they refer to that as a half a couple. Other times I may code a larger chunk depending on what the nature of it is. And I'll give you an example in the next slide, but I particularly don't like hard and fast rules for you must code word by word, you must code line by line, you must code by paragraph. My general rule of thumb is this: code probably more granularly, so more things early on, and that will allow you later on to code more broadly, perhaps not every small piece of data. Another question could be, well, how do I name codes? What should codes look like? And this really um, is somewhat based on you. You want your codes to be short, but not too short. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm in my later coding. I'm starting to be more abstract, more theoretical, and I'm finding stuff that relates to an organization's identity. So I might put OI. And that's great if there's nothing else in your coding that has the initials OI. I remember I was coding data one time and I put OI. Then I realized later on I was using OI for two different things: organizational identity and organizational identification. So my code was too short. So I had to go back and recode to make sure it was long enough that I can remember it. You also want a code that could be summative. In other words, your code should be shorter than your text. I don't want a paragraph long code for a paragraph long statement. So obviously, if it's a word and a word, that's fine. But in general, it should be have a summary of what you find there. And then, as I mentioned, coding changes over time. I'm not going to code in the same way at the beginning of my research project than I will at the end of my project. So again, I'm going to start with closer to the data. So people refer to the term in vivo. It's not just a computer program for analyzing data. In vivo means, something you get as you're using their own terms. So somebody just point out, can a single text receive two codes? Absolutely. That's going to be the next point. So label things. Some people use in vivo, some people use by hand, but whatever you do your codes, you have to be able to memorize or remember what they are. And then how many codes do I need? There's no magic thing. I've seen people say you should have like 100 codes, you should have X number of codes after your first round. Again, I don't find those super helpful. In general, when you're first starting to code, you code a lot. You're going to have a ton of codes. As the person in the text just asked, and you could code the same piece of text in two ways. Doesn't really matter because sometimes, depending on how you look at something, you might have two different codes. Um, Somebody's asking, can you have too many codes? And the answer to that is yes. So what you want to be able to figure out is there's a tension here. You want to have enough codes to build a foundation upon, but not so many codes that you get buried by them. And somewhat this is so what I tend to find if my codes are starting to get too much that I can't keep track of them, or they seem to be that they're, I have like 500 codes after the first three interviews. Well, then I'm going to probably want to go through those codes and start saying, am I using the same code or similar codes? Do they mean the same thing? And I'm going to start to aggregate my codes because we do have a cognitive limit on how many codes we can keep, kind of work with. So the tension is having enough for foundation, but not so much that you can't make sense of them. I do find I tend to find it's probably better to have too many though than not enough. Again, when I was an editor at AMJ and ASQ, I found the biggest problem was that people had said, let's say we're using the Joya method, then they were talking about their first order codes or their initial codes, and they said, I interviewed 500 people, and I had 100 first order codes. I'm like, that seemed like a lot. And so I like for me, I would a couple hundred codes after your first round of coding, to me is pretty obvious. 30, 40, I think I start to wonder if either maybe you've gone into too much with a preconceived notion of what you're going to find or something. But if you think about coding as think about it as kind of as a pyramid. If I don't subsequent, especially in grounded theory, subsequent rounds of coding abstract from your earlier phases. So you think about it as a base. If I have a very narrow base, if I only have like 45 codes, and I want to abstract from that second order codes or more abstract codes, and then theoretical dimensions, there's just not enough there. So you're going to have a very weak, very underdeveloped analysis later on. So have a lot of codes at the start. If you're starting to get overwhelmed by them, my suggestion is go back, start to aggregate some of your codes into broader categories to make it a more manageable number. But in general, more codes at the beginning is probably better. It is better than not enough. So let me give you an example. So one said, should I code each transcript line by line, or can I use granular coding I can get to all that comment there. In general, again, I don't tend to use hard and fast rules on line by line, must do line by line. Again, try to make it meaningful. Let me give you an example here. So this is I was asking an Amway person. I'm looking this way because my transcript's this way. I heard about that Amway is about more than making money. What do you think? And then she starts talking about you see people develop, friendships develop. I make the comparison because then she goes into the death of her husband. People always talk about what to do with widows and widowers. And she goes, men remarry fairly rapidly, talks about the statistics on that. And then she's going to talk about how people treat treat widowers or treat widows. She goes, you have couples that are friends, and now you're a threat to them because you're a single woman. She used the term corn's sake. That's something I've never heard before about, golly gee, why am I a threat? That depends on the faithfulness of couples. And she's kind of rambling on about her life as a widower. And so, or as a widow, excuse me. And at first, like I said, I didn't really look at it, but then I found, so I later coded this, right? And by the way, the colors don't mean anything. The reason why I use two different colors is that I try to illustrate with one color and it looked like I had one big code. So ignore the colors. So the first thing I coded was, you're seeing people develop. All right. She's probably talking about people develop in the business. But then later, the next sentence is you think about the friendships you develop. Well, now it's not so much developing people in terms of making them better salespeople, Now it's about friendships. And then she talked about her death of her husband. And then she goes, suddenly I'm on the outside because she's a threat. And then she talks about, so then I coded, okay, I might code this as widows are threats. And then I am, she as a widow is a threat. Probably want to put all that in there. And then she's not going to talk about depends on the faithfulness of couples, I guess. I was brought up very traditionally. So I may want to code that as, you know, doubts about threats or, faithfulness of couples, brought up traditionally. But there's certainly a theme of faithfulness here. You should be faithful to your spouse. And then it moves on from we've been cut off from couples, drifted away because we got involved in the Amway business. So I'd probably code on feeling cut off from other people. Then I'm going to talk about reasons for being cut off because we got involved in the Amway business. And then, maybe like even with, and then my next code might put even with church friends and I'm awkward. And you kind of see what happens. And then with Amway, we're still friends, et cetera, et cetera. So what ended up happening, so I'm probably going to code the first time pretty close to the data. Notice this is not line by line. The other problem I have with line by line coding is it depends on like what your font size is. It depends on what your margins are, what a line is, right? So it's kind of arbitrary. So if I have 12-point fonts and 1-inch margins, then what a line is on my text is going to be different if I have 11.5 font and 1.5 margins. So rather than talk about line by line, I'm going to say like things that I think, oh, this is interesting. Oh, friendships, seeing people develop, people feeling cut off. All this stuff later, which I thought was kind of rambling, became really important when I talked about, there's a paper I wrote on Amway as an ideological fortress, how Amway works to kind of distinguish itself from other people and how you treated better as a person in Amway than you are outside of it. So this ended up all becoming important. But when I first looked at it, it's like, I'm not sure this is going to be that helpful. So in general, code everything. You can always not use a code later. But if you don't code it, then it's not there. All right. Let's see. There's too many things now coming across on the chat. So I'll stop in a little bit and we can ask some questions. I thought I'd talk about other kind of practical hints for you for coding. The first of which is don't wait until after you've gathered all your data to code it. My biggest sorrow, one of my biggest sorrows as an editor, when I would read a paper and they said I had 100 interviews and I coded them when I was all done gathering data. The problem is if you wait till everything is done to code your data, you've never made any changes with your protocol. You're probably still asking very general questions. So rather than using an inch wide and a mile deep, given our audience, I would say kilometer wide and a centimeter deep data. So very shallow data. And so with their insights are really shallow. They had a lot of data, but they had a lot of very superficial data. So ideally, you're going to not wait. You're going to code your data as you collect it. The second thing is just kind of building on this. Well, if I'm not coding at the end, when do I start to code? For me, my rule of thumb is I tend to collect at the very beginning up to 10 interviews, sometimes fewer, just to kind of get a sense of like what's going on here. So I'll do some analysis after every interview we'll do analysis. So I may do a context summary form, which is a one pager. And this is by Miles and Huberman. And I'll get kind of I'll write down like what do I find interesting in this thing. It's not really summary in the real sense, but it's more like what are some of the themes that might be interesting here. And then I'll do that with every interview. Then after about 10, I start to code them and see, okay, what do I have here? So I'm constantly in my coding analysis. I'm moving down into like breaking these up into smaller chunks, taking a step back, seeing what do I have, diving back in, coding again, coming back out. And then build in breaks if possible. So part of it is this, I'm giving you what I would consider ideal conditions. I was in an organization once that essentially said, you have a week to collect your data. Well, that's the thing. I didn't really have time to like collect a couple of interviews, analyze them, collect a couple of interviews, analyze them. I just had to collect it all. And then I negotiated to go back for a second week. But that's how I did it. So I got to have some deeper data. But with that proviso, think about this, gather some data, code it, gather more data after you've, what I would do is I would change your interview protocol to start getting at more specific themes, code again, gather more data, change your protocols. After that, repeat. And then, when at the very beginning, I may code 10 interviews, or maybe it might even be 5. Go back, change. By the time I'm like, if I'm doing 70, 80 interviews, I'm not stopping at every 10 anymore. It might be bigger time between breaks. Some people really like code books to keep track of their codes. That's fine. This is where coding can start to be a little bit more inductive and deductive. So if you start using pre-existing codes from past interviews to code future data, I think having a code book is fine. However, make sure your code book is always evolving. The other thing I found would jump out at me as an editor, I had this in a paper. I guess it's not an amusing anecdote. It was actually a sad anecdote that said we gathered, I think it was upwards of 60 interviews. They said we coded our first 10 interviews, made it a code book, and then coded the rest of them based on that code book. Like, oh, that's unfortunate because you didn't allow them to learn anything new as they gathered new data, or they didn't allow richer themes to emerge. So unfortunately, their ending analysis was very constrained, very simplistic, and not very deep. So if you have a code book, make sure it is always evolving as you're gathering data. And then lastly, is again, to reiterate what somebody asked before, can you have multiple codes for the same set of data? Absolutely, not a problem. All right. So I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about how to think about coding. So what I've given you is kind of like practical. Here's how you do it. Do 10 code, have simple but not too complex code names. But let's take a step back and think about, why am I coding in the first place? Because if you're coding your data and you're not achieving these things, then you're probably doing something wrong. So this is a great paper by, I'm going to apologize if I mispronounced their names, but Lindenberg and Korsgaard. They talk about, they have a nice thing in their paper about why do we code in the first place? And Locke, I think it's Locke, Golden Biddle, and Martha Feldman had also a paper that just talk about, let's think about the purpose of coding. Well, the first thing you want to code is to have a deep engagement with your data. So this is where I find it dangerous to use, if you have too many preconceived notions about what you're going to find, you're not really engaging in your data. If you're just looking at your data to try to confirm what you think you know, then you're not coding right. If you're not surprised, let me put it another way. If you're not surprised at some point in your coding analysis, I'm going to say you probably done something wrong. I'm always surprised. To me, that's the joy of doing inductive research, that I learned things I didn't even conceive of before I started the project. So if you're not getting surprised, you may want to think about, am I open enough in my coding processes? The second thing your code should do is actually make data retrieval easier. One reason we code, especially if you use computer programs like in Vivo or other kinds of things, one of the things that codes allow you to do is say, find every code of when I put people love their organization. And so it allows you to kind of bring things from different interviews together, and it can be really helpful. Third thing data coding does is reduces the amount of data that you consider. So again, you're not, for a given paper or a given project, you're not going to use 100% of every piece of information in every interview. There are going to be stuff you use, and there are going to be stuff you discard. I have to say the discarding stuff's pretty hard because when you go through, you're collecting all these data. You have these what you think is are pretty good codes, but when you come to write it up, you realize, oh, you know what? I'm just not it's not something I'm interested in. So to give you an example, this is a big problem for my dissertation because I think I asked you to read the Amway paper. Or it might be some you did, maybe some you didn't. Um, but when I was done with data collection, I had hundreds at least, if not thousands of pages of data. And I tried to figure like, what am I going to do with all this? Like, and I have a lot of codes, and it took me a long time to carve out like, what am I going to keep and what am I not going to keep? So for one initial decision I made very early on is that when I'm going to look at, especially for one paper, I'm only going to look at things after people were recruited. So I'm not going to look at the recruitment process. I'm going to look at distributors who are actively involved. That was very helpful. So I carved off a bunch of codes on how we recruit. They call it prospecting. How do they prospect? Go those out. There was other things like, well, I have some really interesting things about how they deal with, how they think about family, how they think about religion. All were really interesting, but didn't really fit the story that you read in the ASQ paper, which was about how do they help people attach to the organization. So they weren't really central. I had a few things, but a lot of codes got dropped there too that I didn't. They get dropped. I just didn't use them. So coding should help you reduce. Like I'm going to think about some of my data more closely than other data. Thirdly, it should strengthen your chain of evidence. So at the end of your analysis, you're going to want to link what your research question was to your findings. And they refer to that as creating a chain of evidence. So if I have codes, I can say, here's why I thought about, here's why I went from why do people love and hate Amway or how do they facilitate connection to at the end, positive identification, disidentification, de-identification, and ambivalent identification. So the codes allow me to make that link. And then your code should also, as I mentioned before, should also reflect the worldview of your informants. So if I use the term a lot, violence to experience. So if you look at your codes and I can't like if it could be some kind of generic any context, then I'm thinking, I may not have done something right. Like, do my codes really give me an understanding of the people that I'm studying? And if not, then again, you may need to recode. And then lastly, it helps facilitate discovery. So surprises, new ideas, new insights. So coding that process should help you think of your data, and I would say think of the world or your theories in new ways. Two more papers, just because we're about at the halfway point, which is where I want to stop and move to analysis. I want to point out two papers. One is two papers that I think do a nice job of thinking about the coding process. So they're not going to say how many codes to code or code line by line. They're thinking about more broadly on what does coding do, and that's Grudal et al. That look at. It's a really interesting paper. They look at coding as a type of categorization process, and so they go to categorization theory to kind of come up with what are the functions of your coding. So for example, they may say one of the function is to focus on puzzles, like something that I don't understand. So I may code for that. I may code for something else. So they really kind of started talking about kind of the functions. And then the other paper, again, by three of the, I think, most wise, most brilliant qualitative researchers around, Karen Locke, Karen Golden-Biddle, Martha Feldman. If you haven't read their work, they're fantastic. They talk about the coding process as a kind of more of a processual way. What are the different activities you have to do in the coding process, like putting patterns together or making codes and things like that. So those two papers, I'll send you a paper that has those papers in their references, but those are really nice papers to think about kind of broader, what am I actually doing when I'm in the coding process? All right, let's take a break here, see if there's any questions before we move on to the analysis phase. We are exactly on time, right? 42 minutes of a 90-minute talk.
If you have any questions, could you please raise your virtual hand so we can see you? Jadwiga.
Thank you so much for all your insights so far. I have two questions, if I may. One is you mentioned about being surprised when you are coding, and I wonder whether this surprise happens to you also when you are interviewing and you kind of mentally carry this over into your data collection. And yes. Another question, if I may, is whether you mentioned that same data set can present multiple codes. And I wonder whether this also can be several paper ideas. And therefore, if that's the case, how do you present your data then in your writing for potential publications coming into this same data set used several times, quote unquote, problem or challenge? Thank you so much.
No problem. Great questions. From where surprise happens, I agree. Surprise happens throughout the process. I get surprised in interviews all the time. And then what I would say, what happens there is that that gets transferred to like a memo or a field journal, depending on what data, and then that will ultimately become part. That does become part of your analysis, if not your coding. But that's another way surprise comes into the process. The second question was, I'm going to put it another way. How do I split up papers for multiple publications? So the first thing is, can you publish more than one paper off of the same qualitative data set? I would argue that you can. However, usually you're using different data for different papers. And somewhat this is going to be on the journal. So even though you can have multiple codes for the same data, if you try to use exactly the same data for one paper or another, they're probably going to say no. There's a little bit of overlap. It's probably okay. So for example, for the Amway study, I think it's one shape or form, maybe 4 papers came out of that. And one of them was like just on recruiting. So that was, remember I said I split that off? Ended up writing a paper on recruiting. So that was one paper. Another paper was on the kind of the more macro ideological structure, was another paper. There was the paper on what you read for, which is identification. And then I took an insight from my data, which was, it's interesting that they seem to actually provoke work-family conflict. That's interesting. And I didn't have enough data on it, so I gathered more data from other companies with the help of a friend for marketing, and that became a paper. So you can do it, but you have to be careful. So they'll ask. I mean, there's a lot of questions that each journal has a checklist at the end. But I know people that have published multiple papers from the same data set. But again, generally, when you're going to argue with it, you're going to be using different data, not a different analysis of the same data. That makes sense? Great. Other questions?
Hi, Mike. I have a question regarding like how does this coding process help you to revisit or change your research question along the way? Like, for example, you said that you can find so many surprises and there might be different directions to go along. Then how do you make the decisions, whether you go after the interesting themes that emerge or you stick to your original research question?
My general rule of thumb is you go where the data takes you. So I'll give it another example of, so I was doing research with firefighters, and I was really interested in how they made intuitive decisions. Because we know that if you're in a fire, you have to make split-second decisions. There had been another author who had done some research on intuitive decision-making in firefighters. So we went in, as we're coding the data, we just, two things happened. Number one, we found out they don't make a lot of decisions. That surprised me. They said, well, first of all, there's not a lot of fires, so we're not making a lot of firefighting decisions. Less than 10% of the calls coming into U.S. fire stations are fire-related these days. The second thing is, well, it's really up to like your commanding officer or the equivalent. You're on the scene. So I don't make a lot of decisions. But what was interesting, they talked about how one thing I always thought was interesting, well, what happens well, if you're not fighting fires, how do you know who to trust? And that became a really interesting idea because they said, well, then I learned about, because an interesting piece of data was people had a really good sense of their own work ethic. I would even say their own work orientations, but they also had really strong ideas how other people were. So yeah, we have these people, we call them paycheck people. They're only here for the money. And we have these sparks who are kind of interested in fire, maybe a little bit too much on fire, but they're okay guys, mostly men. And so that ended up being, so I kind of take a page from Spradley. Spradley goes to, when I'm stuck at it, I always go to, what's the core problem of the people you're studying, or one of them, right? When I'm going in as an outsider, I have a very poor idea of what that is. And what I think might be really interesting for them is not that interesting at all. And if I try to push it, if I try to keep pushing on like this intuitive firefighting thing, I'd had a pretty bad paper when it was done because there wasn't much there. And I'd be really forcing my ideas on them. So I think about my original research question as a opening to start data collection. But I think of it as a scaffolding. Scaffoldings are always temporary to help you build something else. So you don't want to confuse your scaffolding for your building. And so that's kind of how I make the decisions as I go in. Thanks.
Igor?
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Mike. My question would be mostly related to what you have just said about the firefighters. I'm wondering how much weight and/or attention do you give to your personal observations during the interview? So it's not formal coding, but there might some things that you just observe.
I use observational data slightly differently than I do textual data. For right or for wrong, I tend to think there's often less. The reason why I like to hang out with people is because people, I want to say lie, but they may not always. They may not always tell the truth either because they may not realize that they're lying, but they may say. I'll give you an example. So for firefighters, when I was interviewing them, they said, "Oh, we trust everybody." But I'm at the fire station, and clearly some people are in and some people are out. Some people are like more talked, and so I'm like, "Huh." So then I would use that in my interviews. Why do you seem to hang out with some people more than others? Oh, well, that's because these people X, Y, and Z. And then I realized, oh, okay. So as I went on and realized partly because I hung out with them and they started trusting me more, but also because I could ask more direct questions. They said, yeah, we don't trust everybody equally. We trust everybody to some degree, but we trust more than others. And by the time I was done with, several years working out with them, I was like, yeah, we trust these people. We don't trust these people. So I see observations and interviews as informing each other. I often get really good questions from observations that I don't necessarily get with interviews. Another example in Amway is that to really do this, I invited all my doctoral student friends to an Amway sales meeting. And man, they were ticked. Like they didn't talk to me for a long time. But I use that as like, wow, like this, I can kind of see now why people break off when they talk about like their only friends are their Amway friends. But if I hadn't done that experience, I wouldn't have been able to ask those questions. And I also got some more credibility for asking those questions because I had done it myself. So I'm not sure if it's term of weighting, but I do use observations to really refocus and rehone things in my interview data.
Thanks. See that.
Okay.
So a couple more questions, and I think then we maybe two more, then we'll move on to analysis. And then if you still have those burning questions, we can get to them at the end.
Thank you very much.
I
Considering
don't know
your
who's speaking.
Shaya.
All right. Okay.
Yes. Considering your previous talk about that, go where your data takes you. If you have obligation to answer one specific research question, for example, that is by the project that you were funded, how you have to go with that, because there's a specific question that they want to get the answer out of it. And if you want to follow your, let's say, data, you might not answer that question directly. So how we should deal with this part?
I'm not sure I mean, in general, I think we have to let go of our research questions in part. Research questions, I mean, research questions again are help us pick a context. But I think part of it is let me give you a very practical example. Because let's say you're doing a dissertation, and you want to
Yep.
be saying you're doing your dissertation, you put together a dissertation proposal saying, I want to study intuitive decision making on firefighters. And you work through it and you realize, oh, there's really not data here for that. I need to change my research question. So what do you do? And that's when you need to go back and talk to your committee and saying, I know this is what I thought this is what I intended to do, but as it went on, it's not the research question that it's not a really research question that's that meaningful for the people that I'm studying. So I needed to shift it to something else. And then you're also, by the way, I think someone had this in the chat. Then you also have to update your IRB because you might be starting to ask new questions. So I think what I tend to do in qualitative research is to help preface people, especially if there's other people expecting I'm going to do a study of X and the study ends up becoming a study of Y, is to coming into saying, I'm coming in with some questions. I think the questions are interesting, but they may not be at all interesting to the people that I'm examining. I'll know that more as I get in. One thing I do to help mitigate this problem is before I even start a research project, I hang out at that site. It wasn't possible with the firefighters, but it was possible for Amway. So actually, I had probably done 2 months of hanging out at Amway events before I ever went to my committee and proposed a research question. Because then I had my better idea like what's going on here. And so I didn't have to revise my research question quite as much. That help?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Emily?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
All right, so two-part question. You mentioned the in vivo coding, how important it is to, it's really in the people's own words. And you mentioned in ethnographic studies that they're called informants. Is that accurate for other like non-observational ethnographic studies? Like I was sort of under the impression we should call them interviewees, if not if sort of having them reflect on a past experience if we're doing like a case study.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Let me give you a funny story because I promise humorous anecdotes in my talk. So
Okay.
informant is really a term that we use among ourselves. I made the mistake at one time of talking to somebody and said, I wanted to be an informant in my study. The problem is informant in the US in particular tends to be associated with people who tell on other people to law enforcement. And so informant has a very bad connotation. And so I don't use that term anymore when I'm talking with people. However, in some ways, I think it's less of a label for what do you refer to them as. An interview is fine. But it's more the reason why I like to think about them as informants is because it allows me to think about my relationship to the people I'm studying. So if I'm doing a lab experiment, I refer to them as subjects because I'm really subjecting them to manipulation. So that reminds me what their role is in my research project. If I'm doing a survey, they're respondents because they're really answering all my questions. They don't get a chance to really voice much of their own opinion.
Right.
So the reason why I like informants is that I want to think about I'm learning for them in addition to the, that's why I'm studying them. So that's the only reason, but you certainly don't need to use the term informants with them. Yeah, it's just mostly for each other.
That makes sense, but it leads to sort of the second question, which is, we are interviewing people to get their lived experience and their perspective. But from a lot of reviewers and editors, you get the concerns for retrospective bias, social desirability concerns. have you found something useful in terms of, I know we're more coding analysis, but just what are some good ways to alleviate or counter some of those concerns?
Yep. Hanging out with the organization a long time, I think really helps with the, I find I think, let me put it another way. I think being careful, being very articulate and careful about how you collect the data, being very clear on your rationale, your sampling, your coding, your analysis, the kinds of decisions that you made, all that help, I think, assuage some of these or lessen some of these concerns that people come back at you at. Retrospective bias, I think it really depends on the research question you're asking. Like, I'm not asking people to, if I'm doing a study about what happened at a concert, well, then yeah, the interviewers are going to do retrospective bias, right? Because they're trying to remember something in the past. But if I'm asking them, how do you feel about your boss? Well, then that's not really retrospective bias. It's how they feel about their boss. And so, so not all interview stuff is going to be subject to retrospective bias. And the other way you overcome that is that then you say, well, yes, this was my interviews, but I also found this in their observations. I also found some similar things in my archival data analysis. So to the degree to which I can triangulate among multiple sources of data, that will help you out as well.
Great, thank you.
All right. So it looks like we got two more. And I think I think we could do it. Let's try to do two more, and then I will move on to analysis. So who do we start with? I don't know who.
Heather?
Thank you. Thank you so much. My question is about observations during interviews, because I'm interviewing managers on how they deal with emotions. And the emotions, as you were saying, that I might ask a retrospective question, but because they're talking about their emotions in the here and now, they come out. I see them. I observe how they're reacting. And I'm also taking sort of notes on the observations. And I'm not sure how to deal with that in my data, because the text is fine, but then I have all these observations that I've also taken notes of. And I'm just wondering, how do you deal with observations during interviews?
So that's a broad question. So
Yeah.
how do I deal with them? So I'm going to answer this in two quick ways. One of them is even when I'm doing interviews, especially for emotional stuff, I very much, so when I'm interviewing somebody, I don't take a lot of notes, because I tend to find if I'm writing something that people think that that's important, and if I'm not writing, think it's not important. So if you want somebody to talk more about something, start writing things down. Like, oh, this is interesting to you because I'm writing something down. So the two things that I write about at interviews is, number one is emotional reactions, and the second one is follow-up questions, and that's it. So I'm not writing a lot. The
Yeah.
emotions are really helpful to see, like if there's a certain emotion associated with a certain question, then that's something I want to seek out and talk about more later, either in my observations, explore later, or in later interviews. So that's one way to think about the interplay. The other thing is I actually take my interview notes. So observational notes, this could be a talk in and of itself, but the first thing in observation you want to be able to split out is what you see from what your interpretations of what you see are. I'll send along a paper on observation with the other stuff that'll get into more detail on this because it's a little bit far afield of today's talk. But I will analyze my observational notes of what I think what I see, just like I analyze my interview transcripts. So
Thank you. That was very helpful.
you're welcome.
That's
All right, last but not least, Maria.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could give us any tips, ideas on how to act as a supervisor of a doctoral student during their coding of the data. How should we guide them? Should we intervene? If so, how? Can you give us any ideas?
Absolutely. So I tend to, so when somebody's doing an interview for the first of, I do a couple things. First of all, I will co-interview with people to start. I'll do an interview, then my doctoral student will do an interview, and then we'll do an interview, maybe do an interview together. We're both in the same room. So I want them to learn, and I want to see how the interview. So I'm giving them tips at that point, and it also gives me some idea what happened in the interview. Then I'm going to see the transcript. I'm going to ask them to code it. And I'll look at their codes. And it's helpful if I've been in the interview because then I have a better idea of what actually happened. And we go over the coding. I don't do this for every interview for every, because it would be too much. But when they start out, I will go through. So either I'll go through their codes with them. The other thing I have them do is do a context summary sheet, and they discuss that with me. And then we talk about themes, we talk about data analysis. So I'm kind of at the beginning, I'm kind of doing with them. And then as we move on, I'm accompanying them. And so we check in a lot. I'm checking in with, depending on where they're at in the field, I could be checking in with them every other week to see like what's going on. Because if you're not checking in with them until like a month later, they may have collected like 30 interviews at that time, and they may have already gone down a path that may not be that fruitful. So especially at the beginning, I'm meeting with them a lot. What are you finding? We talk about how they're changing their protocols. They give me a draft. We talk it through, make changes. So I'm pretty hands-on to start, and then less hands-on as they move on.
Thank
that help?
you
Cool.
very
Great.
much. Many thanks.
No problem. All right. So we're going to move on to part 2. I think I'll spend more time on this, on the ethnographic analysis than grounded theory, mostly because there's so many more sources for grounded theory. But just to give you, like, what am I looking at when I talk about ethnographic so I'm looking at 2 types of analysis: grounded theory and ethnography. If you're not aware, there are many different types of ethnographic analysis. There are many different types of grounded theory analysis. So to make it simpler for the ethnographic analysis, I'm really going to use Spradley's work. He has a book in 1979 on ethnographic interview, almost the same book called I think it was Ethnographic Observation or Participant Observation, but they're very similar books. Look at his approach. And then grounded theory, largely from Glaser and Straussian, Corbin. Not to get too much in history, Glaser and Strauss did a discovery of grounded theory, ended up taking grounded theory in 2 very different directions. So much so that Glaser ended up begging Strauss to get rid of his book on grounded theory because he thought it was so bad. So don't need to get into that detail. And then a little bit on Sharma. Sharma's, I think, is I would say a lot of younger scholars use Sharma's, also very good. So it's going to be a mix-up, a mash-up of grounded theory, broadly defined, and Spradley's approach. So I've talked a lot about coding techniques. What do I mean about analytical techniques? And I've mentioned them briefly, but I want to give a little more, as they say, meat on the bones here. So one way you can analyze your data that's not coding is analytic memos. And this is where, at the end of an interview or end of a data collection thing, you just write yourself notes. They may be what you found interesting. I use them for emerging theoretical ideas. I tend to date my analytic memos because what I found, again, for my dissertation work, because was figuring things out, if I went through and I had similar theoretical ideas from the start that I did 3 months later, then I'm asking myself, have I come to premature closure on what I think is happening here? So it was really helpful to have them dated to see, I need to start thinking more broadly about my data. Anne Langley talks about chronologies in particular. So one way to analyze your data is to come up with a timeline. I find archival research tends to be best for timelines because you're not getting the retrospective bias stuff, but that's helpful to get a sense of I find analysis helps you get a more holistic sense often of the data. Some people look at narratives. They will construct narratives, again, to kind of as a way to think about like what stories are being told. Martha Feldman talks about semiotic clusters that she does when she analyzes data, ethnographic field notes, and I'll send along the observation paper. But this is largely for my observations or my ethnographic field notes. And again, just make sure you're separating observations from interpretations. Let me give you an example. So I have this exercise in my qualitative methods class, and I say, go observe something and come back and write the notes. And so I had this student who was talking about, and they said, I saw this couple walking into an event. I said, okay, stop right there. Why is it a couple? What do you mean? I said, tell me, like, what does that mean? That's your like, how do you know they were a couple? Maybe why weren't there just two people walking into the? So they go, oh, well, they were standing really close to each other. I said, okay, that's helpful. And so I started them to kind of break down what they saw from their interpretations of what they saw. So, you know, things like couples, or someone said, well, two people who didn't like each other. I said, oh, okay. How do you know they didn't like each other? Oh, well, they, you know, were raised voices. When they talked with each other, their body language was such. And they said, well, to describe the body language. So when you're making notes, make sure that what I go through, I can't separate these out in the moment because it's too much going on, but I'll take notes. I come back afterwards and I try to separate what I saw from my interpretation of what I saw. And so you engage in analytic techniques. And this, again, is from Locke's work. To facilitate intuitive leaps and flashes of insight, moments of doubt and discovery, all about your data. And so, again, I think Karen Locke, Karen Golden-Biddle, and Martha Feldman are really doing a nice job of trying to, we tend to have seen the analytical part as much more, I would say, a black box, mysterious part of analysis. Like I code and somehow I come up with some answers at the end. And they're trying to like kind of unpack, like, how do we get at these insights, these ahas, these surprises? And so I would look at their work, but that's what you're doing in analysis. You're trying to figure out, you're trying to make sense of your data. Hopefully you're making new discoveries. Because if you're not discovering anything, you're not surprised by anything, like I said, you're probably not doing it correctly. So how do you do it? So we're going to start with ethnography. And so let me just start before I get into the specific types, and I went too far. Ethnographic analysis from Spradley, I would say, is much more linguistic than, let's say, something like grounded theory. They are certainly related. Like if you're going to see some logic that's going to should be familiar to you. But let's start with. See, my thing is not having a little trouble with the mouse here. So they think about it in terms of 3 steps and 3 types of analysis that you do depending on where you are in your data collection point and how much knowledge you have. So this is definitely kind of a chronologically ordered way to analyze data. And they talk about their first step is you do what you call a domain analysis. So I'm looking for, they refer to as semantic relationships among terms, concepts, labels in your field. These come from specific kinds of ethnographic interview questions. So the reason why if you're interested in doing ethnographic research, I really like Spradley's book because he talks about 3 different kinds of questions. One is, the first one is descriptive questions. So you may see in a paper, I did a grand tour question. Grand tour question is essentially, take me through a day. Or let's see, I'm interviewing an intake clerk at a hospital. Take me through an intake process. So you're asking them to give you rich description of the stuff they do in their workday. From that, you can do something called the domain analysis. So what you do is you take some term from your data. I'm going to use the term distributor in Amway. So Amway distributor are the people who actually buy and sell Amway products. So if you are interested in an Amway product, you're not supposed to get it on Amazon, though I found out you actually can, but that person's going to get a lot of trouble. You're only supposed to be able to get it through a distributor. But then I thought, well, what is a distributor? And so I decided to look at an inclusive relationship, but a semantic relationship of inclusion. What were the different kinds of distributors in my data? So clearly I've had a fair amount of data already, and I'm going through to say, okay, when we talk about distributor, what are they talking about? And these are all terms that people in my interviews refer to as distributors. Emeralds, diamonds, rubies, pearls, direct, sponsor, family tree. I find this interesting. So have you ever, I don't know if this happens in Europe, but in the US, you will, you may go by a hotel that says let's say Pratt family reunion. That could be a family reunion, but it could also be an Amway event because they refer to their terms as family trees and their events as family reunion. So little little fun fact for you. They also refer to things like upline and downline. So for a domain analysis, you're essentially trying to figure out what things go together. I'm not trying to, it's kind of like, what are the buckets out there? So when I talk about, people talk about distributors, what are all the things a distributor can mean? So that gives you kind of a broad view. You're just starting to kind of figure out what the data is about. You move on from there to a taxonomic analysis. And what happens here is you get these from answering structural questions. And again, in an ethnographic approach, you're going to do multiple interviews with the same person. You start with descriptive questions, then you move to structural and descriptive questions, and then you move on to other questions as well, contrast questions. So for the second part of your analysis, so now I have an idea. Distributors mean a lot of different things. Well, can I get some order out of that? So I know I had upline, downline, all these things. Well, how did that all fit together? So I could do a taxonomic analysis. So I could take the term distributors, and I know that in my Amway data, there were three people that could be distributors. One is people who are former distributors. In other words, were in Amway that quit. And they refer to these people as losers, categorically. So if you meet someone, they talk about a loser, that's somebody who knew about the Amway opportunity and turned it down. So those are former distributors. There's inactive distributors. Inactive distributors are people who still buy products from Amway, but don't sell them to other people. And then there's active distributors. These are people who are recruiting people into Amway, buying and selling products. Of these people, you have people who are direct distributors and non-direct distributors. You don't need to know the details, but this is like your thought process. So non-direct are not making enough money to really sell products on their own. They have to work through their upline. That's how upline comes in. Direct is buying, selling directly from Amway. And then there are different kinds of direct distributors, and there's different kinds of diamond distributors. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a term. Remember I said what a distributor is, all these different types. Now I'm trying to organize that knowledge in some way. That's called a taxonomic analysis. And then the third type of analysis, which comes from asking structural or contrast questions, which is like, what's the difference between like a active and inactive distributor? Or what do active distributors do that inactive don't, or something to that effect? You're trying to, again, they're looking at, I'm going to quote Spradley here, systematic search for attributes, which they call components for meaning, hence componential analysis, a code associated with cultural symbols. I'm not a fan of how they describe it. How I would describe it, a componential analysis. So now I have these categories that I've fleshed out, right? So I've done a taxonomic analysis. Now I want to figure out how do some codes seem to relate to other codes in my data. So there you get an example. So let me take the term active distributor. And I'm going to think about, okay, I know what an active distributor is. So how does an active distributor relate to, like, what do they do? And what's their relationship to what they do? So I do know that active distributors, one thing they're supposed to do is listen to their upline distributors. All right. Then I know they're not a loser. They engage in dream building. They buy and use products. You know, they don't engage in, I can't see it on my slide, but I think that's negative product, or engage in stinking thinking or negative thoughts. You get out of their comfort zone. They buy and they sponsor other people into it. They listen to Amway books and tapes. So now I know some idea of what an active distributor does. So then I'm going to take this analysis, I say it's a part of a componential analysis, and I'm going to compare it to other distributors. Remember I said there were three types, active, inactive, and former. And I'm going to see, okay, on these dimensions of contrast of sponsoring, listening to books and tapes, upline, are they a loser? Do they engage in dream building? Do they buy and use products? Do they engage in stinking thinking or negative thinking? Do they engage in their comfort zone, get out of their comfort zone? And now I'm going to look for, among these three, what is similar? So for between, let's say, I'm going to start with active and inactive. So there are some ways that they are very similar. They do exactly the same thing. There are some things that they do but different degrees of. And there's some things that are due in red, which are just different. And then I'm going to do the same thing with active and former, inactive, you know, so I'm going to compare all three types. So now I have a sense of now a componential analysis. Now I know all my 3 distributors. I know how they're similar and different. Now I'm ready to theorize. They talk about it in terms of understanding the cultural scene. Maybe because it's in 1970, cultural scene seemed to be groovy at the time, so that's how they refer to it. So I'm going to look at, I'm going to start taking my componential analysis to try to build out some kind of sketching out the cultural scene. This is how I did it in my paper, as I looked at, okay, so I have dream building, I have sense giving, I have, excuse me, the things in the italics are the things that Amway people do. Dream building, positive programming, and then I'm trying to make sense of how people get to positive identification, ambivalent, disidentification, and failure to identify, using the different things that Amway distributors do. But that all came from the componential analysis, right? So I know that people who disidentify don't engage in positive programming, they don't listen to tapes, they engage, that kind of stuff. So they're gonna, but they do engage in dream building. So essentially I'm going through and I'm trying to figure out one story from the particular data. And that's what they call a sketch of the cultural scene. So just to kind of go through again. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to have a bunch of these different data, these different terms. First thing I'm going to try to figure out what's all included under a term. So what's all included under a dream builder, right? A distributor. Then from that, I'm going to say, okay, what are different kinds of distributors? So I do a taxonomic analysis. And then my third thing, I'm doing a componential analysis and compare how these different distributors, which I found, and how they vary on these other activities that distributors do. That's the essence of an ethnographic analysis. You may think of it's kind of similar to grounded theory. It's a little different. Analysis, I think coding, for example, starts slightly later in the process. It's much more around linguistics and terms. But there are, as I'll talk about in the end, there are some similarities. Any quick questions on an ethnographic analysis before I move to grounded theory? I also realize we are surprisingly close to 2.5 hours. So, in general, grounded theory, you're going to do, again, the different types. All grounded theory talks about you memo throughout the process. You're taking notes. You're constantly comparing things, the data points throughout the process. When you start, the logic is I'm going to start with open coding, which is close to the data, in vivo codes, very descriptive codes. That's round 1. I'm going to go back and recode my data. I'm going to look for abstracting out from them. How do certainly codes go together? How do they group together under a more abstract theoretical category? Not just, and then how do those different categories fit together is selective coding. I want to point out one thing here that I didn't realize until I had a deeper read of some of these books on how do you do the selective coding. One concept that really helped me when reading, this is from Strauss and Corbin's book, is identifying what your core category is. So in the Amway figure I just showed you, that could have either been one of 2 kinds of core categories. One was an identification category. How do I explain different kinds of identification? I could have also done it around sense making. I ultimately ended up doing identification, but essentially, I'd like to try on different core categories for my data, see what categories seem to make a story and what categories do not. You can also sketch things out. I'm a big fan of that. You have to drop some codes, add some codes, etc. The last thing I want to add, and again, there's a bunch of things out there on grounded theory, but there is some disagreement about what saturation is. And I get a bunch of, I still get, I write a paper review that goes, did you reach theoretical saturation? But the problem is there's 2 different ways to think about theoretical saturation. One is code saturation, which is, have you heard it all? That essentially is, I'm not learning anything new as I interview people. So it's almost like partially from the data collection end. But the other one is meaning saturation. Do I understand it all? That is, do I have enough data to really understand the categories that I'm building? Sharma's is really talking about meaning saturation. Other people talk about it in terms of code saturation, but they're both legitimate forms of theoretical saturation. So Glaser and Strauss and Corbin are not great on the visuals. So the closest person would be, and I think it came up earlier in the chat, the Joya method. I think for me the best thing about the Joya method is what I would call the Joya figure. And what is nice thing about that is it really helps you lay out your kind of your chain of evidence. So I go from my first order, he calls it first order codes, but in grounded theory terms, your open codes, move on to your more abstract codes, and then those become more abstracted as well. I just want to point out something, because again, I get it as an editor. You don't want to have like one open code leads to one focus code leads to one selective code, because that's missing the point of the process. So you can't abstract from one code. You're abstracting from multiple codes. So this is why, remember I said you want to have a big enough foundation to build on. If there's not enough open codes, you're not going to be able to create focus codes or selective codes. So you need to have strong on that one side. Again, I'm not going to go. You can create a model with this as well, and then let's talk about like how do you think about interpretation. I have 2 points kind of to end the talk on. One is when I think about analysis, what's my goal here, and I think when you think about analysis, there's a fundamental tension. The first is I have to understand what my informant's worldview is. That's essential, and you do that by finding out what words mean and what language means. And people, again, are going to use a lot of different terms for this. So ethnography uses first order codes. If you talk to John Van Manen, for example, other people are going to use open codes. Some people will use descriptive codes. But all they're getting at, the essential thing is I'm trying to figure out how to understand how they think, what's their worldview. And then the second thing is, you need to figure out how do I actually come up with kind of a theory of what's going on in the context from not really theoretical, but very contextualized theory from your data. And that comes from your domain analysis, taxonomic and componential analysis. Then you have to translate to a broader audience. So I need to understand what my informant's worldview is. I need to understand what the literature knows now. So I need to find out what the literature says. Kathy Eisart refers to this as unfolding theory. I need to extend and build theory. What you're not doing here, analysis is not theoretical description. I've used this term before. What you're not doing in your analysis is simply taking, I found this and this relates to this theory, and I found this and this relates to this theory. I found this finding and that relates to this theory. If all you're doing is essentially matching different theoretical categories to your data, a reviewer is going to come back and say, well, what have you discovered? Essentially, you've showed us essentially what we already know. So you're going to want to move beyond what we know. So your analysis can't just stop with existing theoretical labels. And the tension is, I need to do this with doing minimal violence to experience. So I need to somehow honor the voice of the people that I'm studying, at the same time translate it to an academic audience. If I make it so abstract and I drown out the voice of the people that I studied, then you're doing violence to experience. So you can't go too far on the theory end, but you also can't go too far on the descriptive end. You can't publish a paper that Clifford Geertz, famous anthropologist, did a ton of very descriptive, of different ceremonies, rituals, the things that he saw. Well, you can't publish that because we need theory. So you can't just do understanding worldview. You can't just translate it too much in the academic audience. You have to kind of have this honoring both. And then if you're doing cross-cultural research, again, an entirely different project. That makes it even more complex. I'll send you a paper on that as well. And then you're thinking about this movement between abstract and specific. all this tension between what my informants say, what does theory say, how am I going to speak to a theoretical audience? It's a problem of translation. And if you're an international, if you speak more than one language, this is a problem. It's never a clean one-to-one translation. So you want to do is try to honor the meaning in your translation the best that you can. All right. So this is my last slide, and we are 3 minutes left. So I'm going to talk about it in a very broad way. And then if we need to go over a little bit, I think I could stay a little longer if you have to, but I know I'm sure people have to go. So for those who have to go, how do we go move from coding analysis to constructing theory? This is probably a talk on its own, but some things to think about. One thing is I really find it's important when I theorize to have a holistic view of the data. So in other words, I need to have a broad understanding of my data as a whole, not just the component parts. So when I did a study of a 6-year study of physicians, it's hard to keep that in your head. So I did a context summary sheet for every interview that I did a context summary sheet that summarized themes from the first year of data that I got, second year of data, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, just so I could get a sense of what was going on in my data as a whole. That's important. I'm big on trying on different constructs and theoretical lenses. Your reviewers will probably force you to do this. I don't know if I ever got a paper in with the theory I was hoping to theorize about in the first time through. So play, that's good. Memoing, keeping track of thoughts and ideas as you go on. Pay attention to your own bodily reactions, like what's exciting you, what emotions get evoked from different parts of your data. That to me is really helpful to figure out what data I need to focus on. Locke talks about creating doubt. I'm a visual person. I take all my later order codes, we call like whether it's their, the most abstract codes, and I throw them up on a whiteboard. And then I say, okay, how do these relate to each other? And I will draw arrows and figures and all sorts of things, and some things drop out and some whatever. But the important thing is you have to play. This is the part of analysis that involves play. Don't be too rigid. Listen to your data. Listen to yourself. And we'll stop there. And I wish let's go to some questions. And for those who have to leave, there are no more content. It will just be Q&A. But any questions? I know I went through analysis kind of fast, but I will send you sources.
Yeah, I have a question.
So as before, if you could raise your virtual hand so we can see you and call you. And also, we'll just stick to one question because we need to keep to the time. Thank you. Go ahead, Jonas.
Yeah, my question is basically about ethnography, and I have a paper about unethical behavior. I also asked a couple of questions already in the YouTube chat, but I don't think you hear me there. So the paper is about unethical behavior in the field of management and also psychology, and I talk about my own experiences with specific unethical behavior by my ex-wife, Jessica Lang, Ute Hülsegger, Eva de Roux, and Johnny Fontaine, and also especially how my daughter was treated by misusing the university, and how the whole field of management basically tries to suppress the story and the truth by silencing me. But my problem is really that I find a lot of things, and really everybody is kind of motivated to suppress it. And especially one thing I find a lot is that there are exception policies in a lot of ethical codes these days that basically protect when people fake data or steal work or just misuse their university. And so I get a lot of whistleblower retaliation, lost my position already, and it's getting more extreme. But yeah, so the question is for me to you as an experienced qualitative researcher is what you do when you find something that the field does not like.
So it's a multi-pronged answer. So I got to give a few things and I want to try. One is I want to point out there's a recent ASQ paper by I think Brian Spencer and Klaus Werup that found unethical and actually illegal activity during their course of the data collection and how they managed that. So that's a good example of and I actually as an editor, I said, well, so did you do anything about it? Like, did you report anybody? And they did not. But it was an interesting,
Yeah,
we had
I
an
did.
interesting
So
question.
I escalated all possibilities and
Yep.
all unethical behavior I found. So especially in the field of management, I complained to the university ethical committees. In the Netherlands, I escalated all the way to the National Ethical Committee,
Uh-huh.
who basically, did not believe me, even though the evidence was there, then suppressed the evidence and do not answer me anymore, even though I even sent more evidence to them. Then in Germany, they constantly try to not look at the data. So they basically they need to look at it, but they constantly refuse it.
Uh-huh.
And the same also happened in Belgium. And also, yeah, so that's basically the situation. So I did it, I reported it all, and I tried to also publish it. But
Did
all
you
the,
try the AOM?
yeah,
AOM?
so AOM banned me from the mailing list.
Okay.
They banned me also from a legacy kind of research method forum. And the reason is also what I found in my research a lot is that the ethical codes basically nowadays have what they call general principles. And the
Mm-hmm.
general principles basically say you need to be respectful, you need to be nice. So, but this kind of runs counter to what actually the ethical guidelines want. For example, that you are true about unethical
Sorry,
behavior.
Jonas, could we just cut to the chase so that Mike has an opportunity to answer, and then we open up for others to ask questions as
Yeah,
well,
so
please?
the answer is yes, I escalated all possibilities and I also submitted to AOM journals.
Uh-huh.
They all did not review my work. I also submitted to ASQ, of course.
Yeah. So the short answer is that there was a colleague of mine that I will talk with. I mean, Jean Bartunik is much more, she would know better on the different things, like different ways. Sounds like you've exhausted um, you've done the things you're supposed to do. You've gone through the right people and reported. Sounds like you're not satisfied with how they came back. Um, So I could ask her. She would have some idea about what to do next. That's just not my area. Beyond what you've now gone beyond my humble knowledge, unfortunately. But I could ask her and ask her to. And if you shoot me an email, I can try to connect the two of you.
Happy to do that.
Yep. Devin.
Hey, how's it going, Mike? Thank you so much for this talk. This was extremely valuable. I have a question about AI.
Mm-hmm. Knew it was
So
coming.
sorry, yeah.
I knew it
So
was coming.
I'm working. Yeah, I knew you knew this was coming. So I'm working with some data, and we're exploring ways to use AI more as like a supplement, not necessarily as like a substitute for our analysis, but like to iteratively engage with AI. And so I was just wondering from your perspective and your experiences, what do you think are the opportunities of AI for qualitative coding and analysis? And what are some of the sort of the threats of AI for both? Thank you.
So I know so little I'm dangerous. So I'll just point it out there. I did. So there's a paper that I'll send along to you that I talk about. I think AI is going to could affect every part of our qualitative research process, from gathering data to analyzing data. Um, I think some promises are being able to play with your data in a different way, knowing that I mean, even AI, I mean, some people think it's more objective, but it's still I mean, there's still bias. But as a way to kind of play with your data and get a sense of like a holistic view of your data, that might be interesting. I'm just now starting to play around with AI. So I think there's some possibility there to help as a tool to help you extend your playfulness in that process. I think the downside is I think there's probably problems if people start to fake their data. So you could construct an entire interview with an AI person. Um, is that an interview? How do we do it? I I I I don't think you want to give AI control. I mean, I do think it's because you've collected the data usually, then you have a certain insight through your data that's not on the page. And so that doesn't get captured by AI when they look at, they're just collating things together. And so my fear is that people would just simply try to say, I need to get this done fast. And so I'm just going to like toss all my transcripts into AI and say, what do you think? I think that's dangerous. If you use AI in any way, just make sure that I think all the journals now have policies. You need to let the journals know. I think where people are going to get into big trouble is that they use AI and they don't say how they've used it. So if you're going to use AI in your methodology, make sure that you kind of note in your letter to the editor or in your methods section in particular how you've used it. But I guess I'm not a naysayer to say, oh, this is doom and gloom. I think there could be some interesting things we could learn from it, but we're so early in this process. So thanks for the question.
Sudhanshu?
Hey, thank you so much, Ibrat, and thank you, Mike, for this amazing, insightful session. I have recently gained a lot of interest in qualitative research, and I'm taking two projects. One project deals with octogenarians, and the other one about millennials. How do they use AI influencers? I mean, how do they have this kind of sickness phenomena playing between them and the AI personas online? Now, the challenge that I face is when you interview an 80-year-old or 70-year-old, the narratives that they produce are very rich, very, kind of insightful. But the problem with these millennials is they are very precise. So the number of questions that you ask also increases, about 32 questions. And again, the responses that you get are very precise. So how do we deal with it in such a scenario? Should we increase the number of questions or should we increase the number of respondents? How would you tackle that? Thank you.
So trying to think at the heart of your question, it sounds like you're not getting rich enough data. Is that the problem?
Yes, I guess so. The narratives, I mean, they're to the point. They do not, reveal much. Probably that's very problematic.
I've had informants like that. They'd like give you 3-word answers to like an open question. That to me, gathering more data from the same kind of people will not be helpful. I tend to find, I could refer to this more of an interviewee type or an informant type. I tend to find what I do with those situations, I tend to end up taking a step back from the interview and trying to build rapport and try to develop more of a relationship with the person. So, because I tend to see that as somewhat as an issue of trust more than anything. And so having them be more relaxed than me. So like, I remember being in the middle of an interview and say, okay, by the way, I'm new to this area. I'm looking for a place to eat after the interview. Can you suggest something? And just started doing some small talk stuff. Got into that. Then we found out we both had things in common. Then went back to the interview and the answers were much better. However, there's some informers or interviewees that simply will always only give you 3-word questions. Then you go on, you finish the interview, and I would then what I would do next, if building reports aren't working, is I look back at the questions you're asking, and to see. I notice a lot of people when they write their protocols, they answer things that are essentially answerable in yes and no questions. So, could you tell me about your day? The answer is yes. Well, okay, that's not all that helpful. Please tell me some more about your day. Like sometimes it's just changing the stems on questions helps a lot. So go back to your protocol and that may see if there's an issue there as well.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Perhaps 1 or 2 questions, Mike. Is that okay?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. Yan Hong?
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question has to do with the collaboration process on projects that have multiple co-authors. And if you could talk about like the general process of collaboration, what are the different touch points that are absolutely essential from a grounded theory perspective? When do we start that touch point during the coding process to reconcile codes? Is it necessary, let's say, after coding 5 transcripts with descriptive coding and each transcript with let's say 300 codes, what does that look like, the reconciliation, and what are the other various touch points that are absolutely essential for the team? Thank you.
So you're talking about team analysis, right? So it's not like you're having multiple authors where one person's doing data, one person done most of the data collection. So my understanding is you're looking at like a team analysis, right?
Yeah, so everybody will be very much involved at every process of the entire project.
So what we tended to do when I'm on a team of qualitative researchers, especially early on, we will all code. Let's say we collected 10 interviews and there's 3 of us. So maybe all of us code independently 2 of them, and then we're going to code some data in common. It's really important to have you all code the same data to start. And again, another story that I had, humorous in retrospect, but I was doing a study with a co-author, and I didn't realize because we hadn't checked in that we were asked, not only was he coding differently, but he started asking very different questions in the protocol based on what he learned. And we were quickly evolving into 2 very distinct studies. And so I'm very big on communication and coordination every step of the way. So remember I talked about like taking breaks in your analysis process, gather some data, take a break, gather some more data, take a break. At those break points, I think at every of those break points, you want to have at least 1 or 2 interviews or transcript that you want to everybody code together just to make sure and then discuss them just to see, hey, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm not seeing. It's okay to have variation in coding, that's fine. But I think you want to talk about why there's variation and why people are seeing things in a different way. Because I think if you don't check in early and often, then, like I said, you can have people that have coded it so different, you can't really compare the codes across your data set. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you got to be really organized to do that, but it pays off in the long run.
And good relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.